Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to topic 2 of This Week in Online World Civilizations 2. Now, last time, of course, we talked about a little bit of the history of Africa after the Cold War. Today, we're going to get into the history of Latin America after the Cold War. Pretty straightforward. So, to get things started, we will, of course, identify the key terms. This week, we're going to look at something called neoliberalism. We'll look at the debt crisis in the lost decade. We'll look at the return to democracy. We'll look at the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we'll end looking at the Northern Triangle migrant crisis. Also, of course, I want to make sure you're aware once again of your upcoming dates. Please let me know if you have any questions about any of these assignments. But I won't talk about them too much here since I did it in the last video. But again, just email me or join my office hours if you have any questions about any of these. But in the meantime, let's jump right into it. So again, how do you think the politics and the economics of Latin America are going to change after the fall of the USSR? So again, very broad questions I asked in my last video. However, how is Latin America going to differ a bit from Africa? And how might they continue the legacy of the Cold War be a bit different here? For example, what's going on with Cuba these days? Very good once again. As some of you may already know, even though the USSR fell, the communist government in Cuba did not fall. So Cuban influence has continued in Latin America and of course within Cuba itself, leading to a bit more of a contentious relationship in some ways you could argue, and maybe even more of a direct legacy of the Cold War than you see in places like Africa. But in the meantime, as we go throughout the rest of this video, still keep in mind, of course, some of the various issues Latin America is going through. Now, one of the main large-scale policies that define Latin America after the Cold War is something called neoliberalism. After the fall of the USSR, liberalism became very widespread across Latin America and was highly supported by the US. Neoliberalism is essentially the resurgence of 19th century economic beliefs, specifically laissez-faire economic beliefs such as privatization, which is of course the idea that private citizens should own all economic production, deregulation, the government shouldn't regulate the economy very much, we should have totally free trade, reduced government and spending, and deficit reduction. Now, why do you think this belief became so popular after the Cold War, and why would America want it to become more popular? Very good. Once again, students watching this at home, this does very directly show the influence of the collapse of the Cold War, or the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since the Soviet Union, the great communist party of communist center of the world, has now fallen, it is going to make sense that now more capitalist policies, such as neoliberalism, will become more popular. And of course, the United States is going to continue to support policies like this, because this is what they've supported the entire time, more free market policies as opposed to communism. So now, of course, that one of their main rivals in world influence is out of the way, the United States is going to see this as an opportunity to encourage more capitalist development within Latin America. Now, however, one of the limitations to this increased capitalization of Latin America was something called the debt crisis. Unfortunately, throughout the latter portion of the 20th century, from really the 70s and the 80s onward, almost all of Latin America was involved in a large debt crisis. One of the problems that happened here is that Mexico and Venezuela assumed they'd be able to pay back various loans they were taking out due to their massive oil exports. Also, Brazil accepted many loans due to their greater than average economic growth. So essentially, Latin America was going through seemingly a period of growth due to investment, so they believed they could handle all these various loans they were taking on. However, by 1982, the debt level in Latin America had reached $327 billion, which of course would be even more by today's money, but unfortunately I didn't feel like doing the whole inflation calendar calculation, so if you'd like to translate that to modern day money, feel free. But in the meantime, sorry, it's that point in this semester. You're not going to get all sorts of crazy math stuff from me at this point. But in the meantime, the debt crisis really reached a fever pitch by August of 1982 when the Mexican finance minister announced that Mexico would not be able to pay its $80 billion debt. In the wake of this announcement, 16 Latin American countries followed suit and rescheduled or refused their debt payments. Only Colombia, out of all these Latin American nations who was in debt, was able to avoid defaulting on their debt payments. International banks, of course, became being very aggressive and no longer would lend money and aggressively called back on all their old debts. Now, how is this going to affect Latin America? And maybe to give you a bit of a hint as to how did this similar situation affect America in the 1930s? Very good. Once again, students watching at home, I'll give you a bit of a short pause on that one because this is, of course, calling back to the stock market crash of America in the 1930s. Whenever you have banks that will no longer lend or are no longer able to lend and invest in an economy, and they go around trying to call back their old debts, everyone's essentially going to go broke, and you're going to have a huge economic collapse with no money to invest and no money in banks to draw from. So, this led to something that many historians and economists have called the lost decade in Latin American history. Because of this huge debt crisis, the Latin America was essentially unable to be really heavily involved or beneficial in the world economy. For example, the U.S. did respond to this crisis by organizing the International Lender of Last Resort, which was a collective effort. Essentially, the banks and the International Monetary Fund would agree to restructure Latin America's debt payments. In return, Latin America would agree to restructure their economies to eliminate deficits. So essentially, this is again a way America is using this crisis to try to push their more laissez-faire neoliberalism policies. On the one hand, banks will stop being so aggressive in calling back their old debts, but in return, Latin America is going to embrace some more of these neoliberalism policies, hopefully to prevent a crisis like this from happening again. I'm jumping too far ahead. So again, how does this maybe remind you of the U.S. policy in Africa, and therefore what might be some of the problems? As I stroke my beard once again like a James Bond villain. But yes, once again, very good. It's again the approach of helping through investment and encouraging capitalism rather than direct aid. So again, if Latin America, like Africa, is not an equal recipient of this aid, or this aid goes to certain countries that aren't as stable as they might appear, this of course could collapse like the African Renaissance seemed to. Some of the ways that Latin America restructured their economy, some positive, some negative. They cut spending on infrastructure. They cut spending on health services, they cut spending on education, and they froze wages and laid off many state employees. Actually, of course, that does mostly seem negative, wouldn't it? So, this arguably has been what has resulted in this period being termed the lost decade, and making many Latin American countries lag behind the global average. Which you can see here, even up to the present day, Latin America and the Caribbean is still trailing behind the global average in terms of economic growth and stability. So again, this lost decade has still had ramifications up to the present day. However, one of the more potentially positive aspects of Latin American history is the return to democracy which has occurred after the Cold War. Throughout the 80s and the 90s, virtually every Latin American country, with the exception of Cuba, saw the end of dictatorial regimes. In 1982, Great Britain, Argentina engaged in the Falklands War, where Argentina was defeated and their military government failed in 1983. Between 1989 and 1990, the United States overthrew the Panamanian, however you say that, General Manuel Noriega, who had been a CIA informant since 1967. The invasion was justified due to drug trafficking, political murder, and human rights violations that was going on in the country. So once again, while this is a positive change, it does still show the lingering effect of U.S. involvement during the Cold War. The only reason this individual had been able to maintain power for as long as he did was because of initial CIA and U.S. support. However, this does show that potentially the United States is no longer willing to support leaders like this, and there may be a bigger push to true global democracy. Also, in 1994, the UN sanctioned Operation Uphold Democracy, which is a military intervention to overthrow the military regime of Haiti, which had been established in 1981, which you can see pictured here. This operation was, of course, successful, leading to a more democratic government in Haiti. Now, however, despite this, like we talked about with Africa, we need to discuss a little bit about whether or not this was actually an improvement. One of the problems we saw almost immediately after these democratic governments were passed is, like the African governments, while they would initially be set up as democracies, there were often pushbacks later once these presidents got into power to limit free elections. For example, Peru, Argentina, and Brazil, almost immediately after becoming democracies, passed election amendments. This would allow for their immediate re-election and continued re-election, which otherwise would have been illegal. For example, in April of 1992, the democratically elected Peru President Alberto Fujimori, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, declared a state of emergency, suspended Congress, called for a new constitution, and replaced all legislature members with his own party. So again, still technically a democracy in name, but he's obviously limiting large amounts of freedoms. One of the more comically tragic things I saw when researching this guy is that actually in 1995, he was about to be opposed by his own wife in elections. So he literally passed a law outlawing his own wife from running against him. So obviously this guy is very serious about maintaining his power. In Colombia, as many of you may know, Colombia has historically had a very large problem with drug trafficking gangs. It actually got to the point where Colombia lost most of the control of most of their country to paramilitaries and drug traffickers. One of the major groups responsible for this is the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, or FARC, which is a terrorist drug trafficking force that promotes Marxism. This group actually announced a return to armed activity as of August 29, 2019. So again, the legacy of the Cold War still can be seen here in a few ways. Finally, I do want to look at what was seen as the ultimate triumph of neoliberalism in Latin America with the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA. This NAFTA was a treaty intended to lower or erase trade restrictions between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. Few benefits and potential negatives. First, it did lead to a resumption of GDP growth between these nations, and to a certain extent Latin America as well. There was a fall in inflation rates across the board as well, and a growing share in world exports. So it did seem that NAFTA was getting places like Mexico more involved in the global economy. However, few possible negatives. Due to the lack of restrictions, there was also an increase in unemployment, with outsourcing and mechanization becoming more popular. Also, due to the lack of restrictions, there was also quite a bit of subcontracting for sustenance wages. So since various countries can now hire individuals for much lower wages, they're going to again outsource their talent and subcontract labor instead of having regular labor contracts. Now, finally, we'll wrap things up looking at the migrant and immigrant crisis, which is of course still affecting us today. For example, it is estimated between 1980 and 2017 that the amount of Central American immigrants and migrants coming to America rose from 354,000 to over 3,500,000. I'll get it out eventually. Now, this crisis arguably is one of the best remaining examples of the legacy of the Cold War. According to Christy Thornton, a sociologist at Johns Hopkins University, the destabilization in the 1980s, which was very much part of the U.S. Cold War effort, was incredibly important in creating the kind of political and economic conditions that exist in these countries today. Now, do you think this is true? Very good. Once again, students watching this at home, I will largely leave that one up to you because it is a bit of an opinion question, you could argue. However, on the one hand, from what we've looked at, it is clear that the United States has been very directly involved in Latin America and very involved in overthrowing various countries there. However, you could of course argue from the other end that this might be justified because of what communism was trying to do. But again, I think we can agree that either way, United States and world intervention is largely responsible for many of these issues still plaguing Central America. Now, since 2008 up to the present day, there has actually been a five-fold increase of asylum seekers from the following three countries in the Northern Triangle. First, you have Guatemala. In 2016, President Jimmy Morales announced he would shut down the UN International Committee Against Impunity in Guatemala after being investigated for ties to organized crime. He did eventually surround the headquarters of U.S.-donated jeeps to shut it down. So again, very corrupt leaders are still being supported in Latin America. Honduras in 2009, the military removed President Manuel Zelaya from power, which was condemned by the UN as a coup, but was supported by the Obama administration in order to continue justifying aid to Honduras. So the idea was that we needed to support this coup, even though it might be corrupt, because if we didn't, we'd have to cut off Honduras from aid. Then, bit of an interesting situation there, of course. In El Salvador, violent gangs such as the MS-13 have been deported to the country from Los Angeles by the Trump administration, which officials in El Salvador argue is making their region even more violent and encouraging further migration to the United States. So, because of this, and again, the potential legacy of the Cold War in causing these issues, how exactly should we respond to the migrant crisis today? What should we try to do to solve it? But in the meantime, of course, that is a tall order, so I'll let you chew on it for a minute. But in the meantime, just remember your upcoming assignments, and let me know if you have any questions about them. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your week, and of course, just let me know if I can be of any assistance. Thank you.